KCRW sponsors include A24, presenting Moonlight, a film chronicling 3 chapters in the life of a young black man discovering his identity and experiencing first love as he moves from childhood into manhood. In theaters now.
Hi, I'm Elvis Mitchell, and thanks for listening to The Treatment. Some of the most entertaining stories produced today, however, are not on the big screen, but they can be heard on KCRW's Unfictional, intimate stories and artful documentaries crafted by some of the most talented radio producers across the world. Check it out. You can find Unfictional on KCRW's iTunes page. From KCRW Santa Monica and KCRW.com, it's The Treatment. Welcome to The Treatment. I'm Elvis Mitchell. It's always nice to have a guest who knows how to use the word Uber properly, and not as a noun, but as an adjective. Let's see now. I guess the Webster Dictionary defines gumption as confidence or courage. And I would now define gumption as a new book by my guest, actor, humorist, woodworker, and now author and also director, Nick Offerman. Nick, first of all, so good to have you back.
Thank you. What a privilege to be back on your show.
Oh, I'll fix that. Talk about the title of the book. Why'd you pick the title Gumption?
Well, my editor, Jill Schwartzman, and I first chose the idea of a list of great Americans, and then we came up with the loose list. We argued somewhat over the final few, but we came up with the list of people, and I said, okay, smart guy, now what's the adhering quality here? What's the glue is the reason that these people should be in a book together? And it came immediately to me. It's their gumption. They all, in one way or another, through their curiosity and creativity and intrepid willingness to go against the pack mentality, have done things with their lives and careers that inspire me and make them heroes to me. And in my opinion, that these are people that I emulate. I hope to accomplish 1/8 of any of their works. And I said, well, that's what should bring people to the bookstore, is the notion of gumption and learning how to find it for themselves.
It's funny because as I was reading the book, the Walt Whitman song of myself came to mind. I am large, I contain multitudes, and also that line, I contradict myself. Very well, I contradict myself, because these are people who fought in every single case that they fought the ideal of what they were supposed to be. Certainly, and you were even educated in doing the book yourself. In the chapter on Yoko Ono, you had to be persuaded a bit that she belonged in the list.
Yeah, I've already, in talking about this book with people, I've already had probably half the people say, you know what, I was in the same school. I thought Yoko was the evil character that broke up the Beatles, and that was... I chose Yoko because her artwork is so heroic to me, and her life and activism is her artwork. And so even to call her an artist is kind of diminishing, because she's more of a grand wizardess. But also, I really wanted to try and help vindicate her to all of those that are ignorant to her true work. And just, they suffer under the misapprehension that the most powerful messianic musician of our lifetimes, John Lennon, could possibly have made any decision that wasn't, fully from his heart. And to blame that on Yoko or anybody else is just silly.
Well, what's interesting about the book, and I almost thought you should call it the Three Georges, because you do have 3 Georges in it: George Washington, George Nagashima, and George Saunders, is that the book is a book really about social justice, and about how almost none of these people that you profile are people who sort of held to the ideal of social justice of their time.
You are so generous. First of all, you're certainly the first to quote Whitman in discussing this drivel sitting in front of you. But yeah, that's what really appeals to me. By hook or crook, I've ended up as a humorist with an audience and or a readership, and it's plain that I'm not as funny as a comedian per se, and I'm not as great of a writer as writers, but yet I have a book deal. And so I say, well, what can I do to deserve this opportunity and this privilege? And look around me and say, well, here's the questions I'd like to ask. We've done a lot of good in our country. We're a very progressive country throughout our history, but we still have a ways to go. And,
blind spots, as you put in the book.
yeah, and what questions can I ask? What conversations can we perpetuate that will help us continue to simply be more decent to one another, which will make us all happier people?
Well, at some point, I find it really interesting that the idea of people responding to violence in one way or another comes up in just about every chapter, and basically sort of taking a stand either against or in the case of Theodore Roosevelt being a proponent of it, but in the way that, again, sort of enumerates the contradictions. Again, when I think of the book, I think of Song of Myself. And those ideas of these people being contradictory in their own lives, but still pushing ahead, is something that you found attractive as well, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, something that I think can be crushing to me and probably a lot of people, but me as an artist, is the notion that I see my flaws when I look inside myself and think, oh, I'm not that worthy. I have flaws, so I should step aside and let someone cuter take the job. And then I say, well, that guy's probably gassy too. He just hides it better. And one of the things that thrilled me, particularly with George Saunders and Yoko and Laurie Anderson and Jeff Tweedy and Conan all come to mind.
Conan O'Brien's the last chapter in the book.
Yeah, they all spoke with great sagacity about that contradiction, about how we're all animals, you know, we're mammals at root, and so we want to reproduce and eat and get places in a speedy fashion on the LA freeway. And there are obstacles to all of those in our lives that we have to learn to take a deep breath and shoulder. And recognizing that we're all flawed is such an important notion to me. That's the beginning of the conversation. George Saunders has this great bit in an essay he wrote for GQ, and it ended up in his book, The Brain Dead Megaphone, where he says they hired him to drive the Mexican-U.S. border when the whole should we build a fence dispute was happening. And he would talk to Mexican citizens and Americans and Minutemen and poor people and rich people. And every time he'd sit down to write about it, he would think that he had a point of view and he had a starting point. And then he would think about all the people he spoke with, and all of their points of view were right in a way. Like he would kind of be swayed by everybody's stance. And when he sat down to write, he's admitted that usually I'd be coming from some liberal, you know, someplace on the left. But as he sat down to write, he'd realize he was completely confused because all of these people seemed right in their own fashion. And he realized that's the truth, that has to be a starting point, that everyone has a different idea based on their terroir, and that is right. No one's ever going to all agree about what color of shirts we should wear to school. But if we can all lay some guidelines, then perhaps some of us can wear pink and fuchsia, which is my dream, without getting into a fist fight.
We'll see. It's early yet. It's the treatment my guest is author Nick Offerman. His second book is Gumption. I just found myself, again, that's why I talked about, for me, social justice seems to be so key in this, because you talk about the contradictory nature of the relationship that Eleanor Roosevelt had to have with her husband, or even he went along with the idea of keeping a de facto enslavement in place while she was railing against this. Yeah,
I mean, and that's the thing is, you know, in a way, I say something in the book like, you can be FDR, who I, think was pretty fantastic in a lot of ways, but that's the conundrum of being the president of the mess of American politics. You know, I certainly would never want that job. You have to be an incredible glutton for punishment. You have to be a lot of things. You have to be obviously very smart and charismatic. But you're also, you're just walking into a show. And so ultimately, no matter how much I like or dislike our president in any given term, I have to take my hat off to them because the load they're carrying on their shoulders is astonishing because we are a mess. And FDR, for example, Pearl Harbor happened and the whole Japanese-American internment camps happened. Well, it was horrible. It was unconscionable.
And Eleanor was against it.
And Eleanor was vocally against it, but it's understandable. You're like, okay, you had this reaction out of fear, and we can understand that as human beings, but you were also dead wrong, and it was terribly criminal what you did in this land known for its freedom and liberty and courage in the face of that sort of fear.
Because you talk about the Third Amendment at one point, and that internment law was a complete contradiction of that.
Absolutely. And so, hopefully, I mean, I believe and hope that we learned from that and said, okay, sorry, guys, that was a bit of a speed bump there. Let's get back to human rights.
I guess what I find so fascinating about the book, though, again, I want to get back to this, is you were saying before we got started, you were thinking about maybe doing a book on tools, and I just feel for you that words are tools, and you admire artisans who are as adept with those tools as you would like to be.
Sure. I mean, I absolutely, am new at this professionally. I still I have to lubricate myself a little bit to comprehend the fact that I've written a second 383-page book and just shrug and say, well, I guess standards must have just fallen that far that...
I'm on the radio. I can guarantee you the standards have dropped precipitously. But again, that idea of you like the way, almost the heft of a word, the weight of a word, the balance of a word, the way you would a tool.
Wendell Berry says some really nice things about what language, specifically reading the written word, can do in the imagination. That the magic that happens, and I think I touch on it in the book, that I can write this idea that you're reading right now, and it's translating in your brain. It's not there's an alchemy that happens that's rather inscrutable, that I think is a magic unlike seeing a film or any other art form. And that's why he is very old-fashioned and very rigid about his adherence to simply the written word. And he won't let anybody adapt his stuff because he doesn't want to see...
As you learned very early on.
Yeah. And I'm still plying my troth over in Kentucky. But when he talks about... There was a great conversation at his kitchen table between his wife, Tanya, and himself and me, where she said that she loves to hear... We were talking about adapting his work to... I've asked if I would love to do it on stage, on screen, anything. I would just love... I'm a storyteller, and he writes the best stories. He said, why don't you write your own Wendell Berry, flavored thing? I said, well, I could, but it would suck. I mean, why not? Of course I'm going to ask you. Your stories are the best. In a pinch, sure, I'll do some crappy thing on the Hallmark Channel someday, but I'm hoping to avoid that pitfall. Nothing against the Hallmark Channel. They do wonderful work, but it would be, I think it would be a rather watered-down version of what I could do with his work on stage or in a film. And he said, when you begin to adapt people's work, to me, that it loses some of its potency. And Tanya, his wife, said, but I love to hear a poet read their work out loud because you can learn a lot about how they intend their words to be read. You hear their inflections, their rhythms, their tone, their timbre. And he said, well, that's fine. You can hear other poets read, but not mine. And they got into a little bit of a back and forth argument about it that was so charming, because he said, I understand that, and I appreciate where you're coming from. I think that's good for Shakespeare. I just don't want to hear my writing written that way.
We have to take a break. My guest, who apparently is going to be giving Nancy McKeon some work in the near future, is Nick Offerman. His newest book is Gumption, It's the Treatment. There's more to come.
Take KCRW with you on one of our smartphone apps. Available for the iPhone, Android, and BlackBerry. You can stream KCRW live, listen to podcasts, and all our news and music streams. Learn more and download at kcrw.com/apps.
Welcome back. If you're still listening from the Hallmark Channel, this is The Treatment. My guest is actor, humorist, woodworker, and author Nick Offerman. His newest offering is the book Gumption. Clearly for you, going from songwriter to an author to Frederick Douglass, even to Frederick Law Olmsted, they have a power for expression that clearly just grabs you in some way. The idea of somebody who can speak his or her thoughts in a way that makes that their point of view entirely clear is something you find enormously attractive.
Yeah, I think it started very much for me in college. I think I had an insular enough upbringing in my small town of Minooka, Illinois, that was very happy and comfortable. And I knew I achieved what I needed to. I scored the grades, even though I was also making mischief at night. I sort of amassed the points necessary to move to the next level. And I knew there was an underbelly that I later learned was simply conservatism and racism and homophobia in my small, white, mostly Christian town. And it was when I got to college in the bustling metropolis of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, it really, I met, my first minorities and my first gay friends. I honestly didn't know there were still Jews around. I had read about them. I had read Portnoy's Complaint, but I was like, a friend in college had to teach me what bagels and lox were, and he thought I was putting them on. I was like, no, breakfast is bacon and eggs, friend. What is this salmon? Oh, this is quite delicious. What are these capers you say? Fantastic. The world is amazing and multifaceted. And I looked into this great group of friends, Joe Faust, Richard Ragsdale, Rob Kimmel, Mike Flanagan, Greg Tatro, who turned me on they just handed me art. They handed me first the Beatles. I was like, man, these guys are great. This is 1988. I was like, these guys are going to sell some records. I mean, this is really some catchy stuff. But then it immediately was more underground. We were adherents of David Lynch and Laurie Anderson and the writer Robert Anton Wilson and the Church of the Subgenius. And they just turned me on, the Talking Heads, like they turned me on to all this stuff that didn't make it onto the radio back home on the farm. And so soon enough, we went to see Laurie Anderson do a live show.
And Laurie's in the book.
On campus, yeah. She's just such an absolute hero to me. She strikes me as someone who would have lived in Rivendell with Elrond, but she probably would have been kept on the outskirts because she liked to cause trouble. And she had a couple songs, she's this great performance artist, but also a wonderful musician. And there was a bit in one of her songs, a little spoken word, where she says, for every dollar a man makes, a woman makes 63 cents. Now, 100 years ago, that was 62 cents. So with that kind of luck, it'll be the year, 6,668 before we ladies make a buck. And that just slapped me to the floor. I was like, oh, that's putting it quite plainly. And that's when I began to look around and see, oh, there's still some things to address in this fine nation of ours, and how wonderful that message was communicated to me through a delightful, magical evening in a theater full of music and whimsy. And so there's elements of that, I think, to all of these 21 characters, that they took their circumstances and said, okay, I have a gift for boat building or for writing or for elocution. How can I use this gift, this opportunity I've been given to pass along this message? And that's what really tripped my trigger.
Well, the book is broken into 3 sections: Freemasons, Makers, and Idealists. But I think those sobriquet could apply to almost any of those people. They're interchangeable, aren't they?
It is. I mean, it was a little bit arbitrary. It's like, let's break this into sections, because that's what you do with a overlong tome of writing. And we went back and forth, because everybody I'm not allowed to speak about who is a member of the Masonic Temple, but beyond that, everyone certainly falls under the mantle of both idealist and maker.
I think so too. And you're talking about your friends who, as you got outside of your small town of racism, Illinois, who brought you into the bigger world. One of them introduced you to somebody for whom we share a fondness.
That's right. I was introduced right away at college by Darren Criss to Tom Laughlin, who played Billy Jack most famously. But he was just a wonderful.
And by the way, Billy Jack being a sequel, of course. I mean, from Born Losers, and he took this character and built a place for it. And again, going back to the contradictions of the world at the time, and that great anecdote, which I did not know, which you mentioned in the Tom Laughlin section, about the head of Fox being a member of Creep, and trying to suppress the movie and being forced to give it back to him.
Yeah, that was, and that was only one of several anecdotes. He had an incredible career of Robin Hood-like pranks in the business. At one point, I forget which part of the altercation. In these big rights battles that he was in with Warner Brothers, at one point he rode onto the Warner Brothers lot on an elephant. And one of his daughters, who in the film, Teresa is one of his 3 kids, and she plays I forget her name in the film, but she's the little blonde who sings and is very outspoken. In fact, it was her reference, there's a courtroom scene where she compares a Nixon quote to Hitler. It was that. That was why the head of
20th Century Fox
of Fox couldn't stand behind it. But he would bring his daughter Teresa and challenge the heads of these studios to either arm wrestle her or play tennis against her. He'd say, "Look, if you can beat my daughter, who is 12." If you can beat her in tennis, then I'll drop this lawsuit. He had just a wonderful, pugnacious attitude about dealing with the sort of corporate dumbing down of the artistic product. And he was a wonderful activist for human rights and for American decency. He even in Billy Jack, I describe it in the book. I say, his message is one of nonviolence. But given the sort of action hero of the time, it was an incredibly violent homage or paean to nonviolence. And, that's a great example of it's very Rooseveltian in terms of Theodore, that he also was a wonderful humanitarian, but at the same time, he said, we have to be prepared to beat the crap out of other countries in order to promote a humanitarian ideal.
Well, my guest who's furthering the Whitman-esque in his new book, Gumption, is author, actor, woodworker, and humorist Nick Offerman. I even find myself thinking again about the way people use these voices in the Conan O'Brien section, where he uses that sense of the absurd and surreal, and sort of making us ask questions about the status quo, doesn't he?
Yeah, I've known Conan. There's not a bigger sweetheart or a smarter guy that I've come across, and I've met Rob Lowe, and I've known Conan for many years, and I had no idea. Once even though I'm lucky enough to be a pal of his, I still had to do homework on these people just to make sure I got his birth date right and what have you. And in researching Conan, I said, "You son of a bitch." He was the valedictorian of his Tony Boston High School. He is one of only 3 characters in history to have been the president of Harvard's Lampoon for 2 years in a row. He absolutely hides his incredibly bright light under a bushel, and instead affects this sort of bumbling, clownish persona to get his agenda across, which is to deliver medicine to all of our souls, which he's done so successfully. And I was like, yeah, you've done a great job. I mean, I noticed, I learned this about him. We once went on a bike ride together around Seattle, and he showed up, he's an avid cyclist, so he showed up in a cycling outfit, slathered in sunscreen, And he looked like he was ready to ride in the Olympics. He's incredibly athletic and quite imposing physically. Like, he really pulls off looking a lot more like a marionette of If Howdy Doody and Tilda Swinton had a baby. I don't know how he does it on his show. Like, he's tailored to look more lanky, but he's actually quite studly. Like, he could play a king in a Viking movie.
But here's something that was the last question I want to throw at you. It's something I see in your first book, which I'm sure you will disparage as well, but that's for another episode. The idea of balancing the spiritual and the physical are pretty important to you, aren't they?
Garbage, yeah. That's a terrible piece of writing. Yes, I've been real lucky in my life. I stumbled into, in my theater department, I ended up with a movement teacher named Robin McFarquhar and a kabuki teacher named Shozo Sato, and they brought so much more spirituality into my life than any of the Catholic upbringing I had been a part of, because as opposed to the Catholic Church where ideas are ephemeral and, there's just not a lot of tangible application when you sit in church and you hear these stories from the gospel. I mean, I get it. We're supposed to take a message home and be nice to our neighbor, even though he's a dick with his Christmas lights. But in these classes in my theater department, we were taught, I was pulling weeds with my sensei, Shozo Sato, and he said out of nowhere, pulling weeds is the same, comes from the same human impulse as war. And I said, well, I'm going to need a little more exposition than that, Shozo. And he said, well, when you pull weeds, you want your plants, your flowers or your vegetables to receive the water and the sunlight and the nutrients. And the weeds are bad. They're going to steal those things from your garlic or from your strawberries. And war is the same thing. You want your kids, you want your seeds to receive all of the proteins and all of the water and all of the goodness from the world. And if these other, if these people from the next county are taking some of those fruits, well, perhaps they need to be decimated. If you don't want their crop to grow stronger than your crop, because eventually your crop will wither away to nothing. And I said, if you don't mind, I'd like to hang out with you for a while, and you could talk more like that to me. That made me look around me in the world and see where I could apply the lessons that Christianity sort of failed to make concretely stay in my life. Through more tangible writings and lessons like that, I was able to say, oh, you're telling me the same stuff Jesus was telling everybody. Your delivery system is just more effective. And so in this book, I also try to open up Christians' minds and say, look, all religions, all religious writings have something beautiful at their heart, but it's how we apply them in everyday life. It doesn't matter if we go to church or not. It's how you and I interact, and if we are decent to one another or if we're jerks to one another.
Yeah. Nick, I'm sorry we're out of time, and you got to come back more than once every couple of years. The new book is terrific. The book is Gumption. My guess is, I love saying this, actor, humorist, woodworker. I'm going to add author to that list.
You can throw a dip in there, please.
And this is public radio, and you've already said one sentence is going to get us straight to hell anyway. Nick, thanks so much for doing this. Really, thank you.
Thank you, Elvis.
My pleasure. Recording engineer here at NPR West is Carlos Asensio. The show is mixed by Melissa Morton, edited and produced by Jenny Radelet. I'm going to go get some fuchsia. It's The Treatment. To catch up on past episodes of The Treatment, go to KCRW.com or listen on your smartphone with KCRW's mobile apps, or subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. The Treatment is produced and distributed by KCRW Santa Monica.